After grading the article summary submitted last week and visiting with your colleagues in the blended classes, I thought it would be helpful to share a few follow-up thoughts. It seemed like the transition from the self-check activities to the assignment that was graded for accuracy could have gone better for almost everyone, and I think there are a few things that caused that. Part of it might have been my effort to break it down into small, easier pieces can make it a little harder to understand the big picture, so we can't see the forest for the trees, so to speak. That can make it a little difficult to think about the assignments as more than just checking off a box. Add that to the fact that we're all spinning a lot of plates, and it can be hard to be too motivated to do anything other than just get it done. Thinking about the summaries more deliberately can be beneficial, though, for this class and as you continue in other classes. I'll explain more about how they relate to other assignments in another set of slides. For now, I'll focus on the summary worksheets, including why each section is meaningful, where the information can be found, and what I noticed in looking at the submissions for the assigned article assignment. The focus of the article might be the most important thing to think about. It helps guide our reading by telling us what the authors were interested in, so we know what the results are about and we know what to look for in understanding the study. In many cases, we can find the general idea for the purpose in the abstract, and knowing APA style helps us know it will also be in the introduction section. Usually, skimming the first and last few paragraphs of the intro helps us identify the sections we need to read more closely. With both of the article options, and across all of the sections of the class, the most common error in this section was not including all of the information. The stress overload article had a second goal, and the mindfulness article had two hypotheses, but most of the submissions for the assignment only included the first. Knowing the purpose helps us identify the population of interest. I include that on the worksheet for two reasons. First, it helps me assess your understanding of the concept of the population of interest, which is an important concept in research. Understanding that also helps you become a savvy consumer of research in the long run. If there is a particular population of interest, we usually find a reference to it in the title or abstract and see that idea repeated in the purpose. Sometimes it seems like they're just talking about people, and that could be interpreted to mean the population of interest. Thinking about how they recruited participants and what that means for their sampling method has a few purposes. First, it gives us ideas for how we can obtain participants for our research. It also helps us put the findings in context. If the mindfulness participants had been told by their bosses that they were required to participate and the researchers didn't find significant results, we might speculate it was because the participants didn't care. Identifying the sampling technique also allows you to practice applying the concepts and demonstrate your understanding. In APA style, we typically find the information about recruiting in the participant section and the procedure. Then we can use our knowledge of the concepts and the population to identify the method being used. There were a few common errors related to this section, including not including specific information, like the locations or that the mindfulness study recruited by posting flyers and so forth. In some cases, there also appeared to be confusion about the difference between probability and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling means that everyone in the population of interest had a chance to be included. So if the stress overload article was interested in people in general, you could ask yourself, could I have had a chance to be a participant? You might laugh and say, no, they were in another state. So, you know it wasn't a probability sample, because that means not everyone in the population could be included. Similarly, the mindfulness article was interested in people with a job. I don't know who all you know that has a job, but I know you know me, so you could ask yourself, could Dr. Francis have been a participant? And since the study was in the United Kingdom and I'm in Maryville, you know it's not a probability sample. The other thing that seemed to be confusing was the difference between random assignment and random selection in the mindfulness article. Random assignment means that each of the 200 and some participants had an equal chance of being in the intervention group and being in the control group. Random selection refers to a probability sampling process. After we know how they recruited the participants and what it means for sampling, we want to know how that worked out for their actual sample and what that means for applying the results. The information about the sample provides important context for the results, and thinking about that helps you become a savvy consumer of research. You might have noticed I didn't have points assigned for the generalizability section. Everyone made good point in that section, and there's almost always a concern in this regard. I don't want to emphasize that too much as we're thinking about individual studies, though, because it can make us pretty discouraged. It can make it a bit like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There's typically something valuable to learn. We just need to make sure we're taking it with a grain of salt. So how do we find this information? APA style typically makes it pretty easy to find in the participants section. Sometimes authors add follow-up information in the procedure, and in the case of the Overload article, they add a table near the procedure section. Our knowledge of the population also adds to our ability to think about generalizability. The common error in this section was not including complete information about the number of participants in each phase and wave. That can be helpful information for interpreting the results. The Overload study, for example, had a drop-off between the first and second survey administration. It might not mean anything, but if those people were more stressed, so they just didn't have time to come complete the second survey, it might have influenced the results. The information in the variables and operational definitions section of the worksheet is important to understand for a few reasons. For one, it's how the researchers define the variables, and therefore what they actually mean when they say overload or well-being. That understanding helps us interpret the findings of the study. The information in this section can also help us with our research. If we want to measure stress overload and we have good notes about it from this article, we don't have to go as far to look for a measure. That goes along with the last reason it's important to understand the information in this section. It helps you apply the terms we use to talk about measurement. In APA style, the information about the operational definitions is in the materials and the procedures section. Our knowledge about variables and how they are operationalized helps us make sense of that information. There were two common errors in this section. About half the students in each section read the mindfulness article, so over 30 people overall, and only 2 included the manipulation of the mindfulness variable. That was an important part of the study because it's what they thought would influence well-being and workplace stress. I think there are a few reasons that got overlooked. One is because a lot of studies we've looked at were non-experimental, so we didn't have as many examples of the manipulated variables. That means we got used to stopping after looking at the measure section. It might have also been confusing because they mentioned the mindfulness measure that they used for the manipulation check. That means they just used it to make sure there really was a difference in mindfulness between the two groups. If we stop to think about the purpose, though, it helps us remember to keep reading. That line of thought would also help us explain why the blood pressure measure was also missing in several submissions. Most of the details about that were after the information about the mindfulness manipulation. Another common error for both articles was including incomplete information. These articles were a good example of what we would ideally see in descriptions of measures, so they had the majority of the details mentioned in the prompt on the worksheet. The research design section also helps you apply the concepts we've learned about in the reading, and, in the process, reminds you what you can and can't say about the results. More specifically, whether we can suggest cause and effect. The information for this part of the worksheet comes from your knowledge of research designs from class, using information in the purpose and the variables. The most common error for this section was referring to the mindfulness article as non-experimental. I have a feeling that was a result of what I mentioned earlier about overlooking the manipulation. The summary of results helps us remember what they found from the study. Our knowledge of APA style helps us know that it's included in the results section and also usually mentioned in the discussion section. The Overload article included in the summary in the paragraph before limitations in the discussion, as well as summary paragraphs within the results. And the mindfulness article included a summary in the first paragraph of the discussion. Common errors in this part of the worksheet were referring to previous research in limitations instead of the results of the Overload article, and discussing the manipulation check instead of the results of the experiment in the mindfulness article. The last section of the worksheet is intended to help you think ahead to when we write the literature review in the introduction section. I tend to refer to that section as being like telling the story of what we know. If we just paraphrase the results or report on them, it gives basic information. But that basic information can have different meanings in different contexts, and we want to write about it in a way that helps the reader know why we think it's meaningful. We do that based on our knowledge of the purpose, the variables, the research design, and the results. Even though we're putting it in context, we still need to accurately convey the design and the variables. Otherwise, it's not accurate. Those were common errors in the worksheets, as were unclear wording.